Okay, so just an overview of the rest of this week. Today is, we're gonna be going over Reconstruction, and on tomorrow, we're gonna be going over Radical Reconstruction. So some of my favorite historical figures we're gonna talk about tomorrow. And just to preview, the mid-quarter assessment for APUSH is next Tuesday, the 8th. It is going to be a 5-document DBQ, similar to the IA and mid-quarter from last semester. Same study guide, actually, with the Unit 4 exam. You can use the same study guide. I'll make a smaller study guide for the Civil War and Reconstruction stuff, but it's going to be on the stuff that we've been covering. So if you did well on the Unit 4 exam, you'll be set up for success for this. And if you didn't do the study guide for that exam, I recommend doing it for the IA as well. Not the IA, the mid-quarter exam. It would also help with the IA, but that's in like a month, so we're not worried about it. Okay, so we are going to start our lecture on Civil War and Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. And today, our main character of this lecture is a freedman. What is it like to be an emancipated person in the South? How does that change your life? How do things alter? What kind of priorities are now involved in the country that weren't there before? Give me 1 second, I need to turn off this light and then we'll get started. Yep. Okay. So we are going to start this issue of readmitting the states. As Northern victory became more and more obvious, we also had these questions of, now what do we do with them? What do we do with the South, who, committed treason and left the North, but whatever. Just as a reminder, do not worry about writing every single word that I am saying. Really focus on those 3 key terms that are in the left-hand column of those note templates or at the top of the slide. That's what you really want to be listening for. They had a bunch of different plans going into this readmission of the states into the Union. Lincoln had an idea that was really focused on the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was ratified by the Northern states in 1865. It was ratified by the North states in 1865, and it prohibited slavery. So the 13th Amendment is what officially outlaws slavery in the United States. Lincoln's main goal was any Southern state that was being readmitted into the country, he wanted them to ratify and approve of the 13th Amendment. So that was his expectation for a Southern state to come back into the Union. They had to ratify and adopt the 13th Amendment. However, this had a lot of polarization. On one side, you have Democrats who say that they should not have to ratify this amendment. On the other side, you have radical Republicans. Radical Republicans were led by Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus is spelled T-H-A-E-D-E-U-S. So again, the Radical Republicans are led by Thaddeus Stevens, who was a congressman from Pennsylvania. And the reason why he and the rest of this group of Republicans were considered radical is because they believed in abolition and racial equality. So again, radical Republicans believe in racial equality as well as abolition. And their solution for Reconstruction was the Wade-Davis bill. So again, the Wade-Davis bill was put forward by radical Republicans who wanted to make it harder for the South to come back into the United States. And in this bill, they wanted to make sure that these new freedmen were given access to equality. Unfortunately, in April of 1865, things changed. On April 14th, Good Friday, actually, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. So again, he was assassinated on April 14th, less than a week after the Confederate military surrendered. John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate sympathizer, obviously. And he believed that the South should not have surrendered. But as the nation mourned the death of Abraham Lincoln, in steps the new president, Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was very different than Abraham Lincoln. Probably my least favorite president. Johnson is a Southern Democrat and a former slave owner. Because of this sympathy, he gave amnesty to all Southerners. Amnesty is spelled A-M-N-E-S-T-Y. And amnesty means like you are forgiven, you do not have to face repercussions for your actions. He also did not force the South to follow new Reconstruction laws. And because of this, the South creates Black codes. Black codes are a series of laws that deny African Americans their civil rights. And is basically slavery under a new name. During the Johnson presidency, there is a lot of difficulty for the freedmen in the South, but there are still some positive changes. The first is the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865. So again, the Freedmen's Bureau was founded in 1865, and their main priority was to help freedmen assimilate into the into society. So again, their goal was to help freedmen assimilate into society. This means giving them food, giving them clothing, and most importantly, giving them an education. Despite these really great goals that the Freedmen's Bureau had, because of lack of support from the Johnson administration, there were still issues. One of those being sharecropping. So the next key term is sharecropping. Because of Johnson's amnesty plan, all former Confederates were given back their confiscated property. And so now that former Confederates had access back to their land, they developed the system of sharecropping. And what this meant is Black Americans could rent land from former slave owners and would give them a share of the crops that they grew. But because they were not given reparations or anything to help them assimilate, despite the Freedmen's Bureau's attempts, many ended up living on the plantations that they had been enslaved on. And they were put in a state of chronic debt. And what this chronic debt meant was as much as they rented and as much as they grew on their property and gave back to the person that they were renting property from, it was never enough and they could never create financial independence. So sharecropping forces formerly enslaved people to continue to be reliant on a plantation owner. Despite this, many freedmen left the South and relocated to the North to find a better way of life. Next, we're going to look at some of the politics and the policies of early Reconstruction during the Johnson administration. In 1866, radical Republicans ratify the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. That is something you should have word for word. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. And it gave citizenship to anybody born in the United States. And what this means is that, in theory, whatever race, whatever gender, whatever sexual orientation, etc., under the 14th Amendment, you are entitled to be protected equally, despite any of these factors. So not only with the 13th Amendment, slavery is ended, and with the 14th Amendment, African Americans are given citizenship. And after they were able to get the 14th Amendment ratified, radical Republicans continue to create new legislation and new policies to help African Americans or newly freedmen guarantee and protect their freedom. Some of these came in different societal groups. The first are the carpetbaggers. The term carpetbagger is not a term of endearment. It is very much, it is an insult term. And carpetbaggers refer to the Northerners who went to the South to help with aid programs, help the states make money. And in general, just help the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau is an example of carpetbaggers. And this is a term still used today. And again, it is not a positive one. Another term of people that were involved in these Reconstruction policies are the scalawags. And again, this is not a positive term. The scalawags are Southerners who support the North after the war. So again, scalawags refer to Southerners who support the North after the war is over. So again, and both carpetbaggers and scalawags are heavily distrusted by those in the South. And again, just like a side note, I was called a carpetbagger when I lived in Virginia because I wasn't from there. And I had the audacity to talk about the Civil War. It's a fun place. Do not recommend. Well, it depends on where you're going. Great. We're now going to look and see at how Reconstruction changes under the new presidency. Andrew Johnson was heavily disliked by the radical Republicans. and many considered him to be corrupt, to the point that they chose to impeach him. So they chose to impeach him because of his continued vetoing of their policies. So vetoing, V-E-T-O-I-N-G, vetoing refers to a president preventing a law from being put into place. And in impeachment, which is a relevant thing from this year, in impeachment, the House of Representatives puts the President of the United States on trial, and the Senate serves as a jury. And they determine under impeachment whether or not a president should be removed from office. Ultimately, Johnson was not impeached, but this was such a scandal that it basically set up the end of his presidency. So the impeachment spells an ending for the Johnson presidency. And in 1868, the American public decides to elect Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is the Civil War general that helped win the Civil War for the North, and he becomes the 18th president of the United States. Grant was extremely popular among Americans. And he was a Republican who was dedicated to Black suffrage and protecting the rights of newly freed men. So he was very much an ally to the radical Republicans. In fact, under Grant, the 15th Amendment is ratified. The 15th Amendment was passed in 1870. And it guaranteed the right to vote for all men, including African Americans. So the 15th Amendment, all African American men can now vote. Under the Grant presidency is when we see the most success in Reconstruction because of his dedication to the cause. And we see some major political gains during the Grant presidency. As we just mentioned, there was the ratification of the 15th Amendment. And we also see a large amount, well, a notable amount of African Americans being elected to Congress. In 1870, Hiram Revels becomes the first African American elected to first African American men to be elected to the Senate. And quickly, within the next few years, he would be followed by 6 others. What's notable is that all of these men elected to the Senate were freedmen from the South. So again, these are formerly enslaved people that are now elected to the Senate. However, as we know, with all progress in American history, there is always some form of regression. In response to Grant's efforts in Reconstruction policy and the election of African Americans to the Senate, we start to see ex-Confederates begin to work harder to reclaim their local governments. One of these groups is called the Redeemers. And the Redeemers are Southern Democrats who sought to remove all radical Republicans and redeem the South. And the Redeemers specifically targeted African Americans and carpetbaggers. Around the same time, we also see the creation of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. They are officially founded in 1865, almost immediately after the Civil War ends. And became almost synonymous with Southern Democrats. If you are a white Southern Democrat, good chance you or a relative is a part of the KKK. And we start to see Reconstruction come to an official end with the Compromise of 1877. In 1876, we saw an election that is very similar to the one that we just lived through. And I talked a little bit about this with you guys after the election. In the election of 1876, the Electoral College vote was disputed. (184 to 185). And so the election started to take a little bit longer than it should have. And so the Democrats and Republicans made a deal known as the Compromise of 1877. The Democrats, there are 2 parts to this deal. The first, the Democrats would allow Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, to be president. So again, that first part, Hayes is allowed to become president. And the second part, the federal government would remove troops from the South. All federal troops would be removed from the South. And now that federal troops are out of the South to protect freedmen, this is the end of Reconstruction and the end of positive gains for a very long time. And this is when we start to see the beginning of the Jim Crow South, or the Jim Crow era. So Reconstruction ends at 1877, and historians argue that Jim Crow South started in 1877. During this time, many Southern states put in an effort to destroy the rights of freedmen in the South, known as the Jim Crow laws. One of these is through segregation, which forced the separation of freedmen from white citizens. Another way to limit the rights of freedmen, we also see as the start of many voting restrictions. The 15th Amendment is a part of the Constitution. African American men have the right to vote, but the South creates a lot of sub-laws that makes it harder for them to exercise those rights. There are several tactics that Southerners use, but we're going to discuss 3 of them. The first way that they did this was through poll taxes. So poll taxes forced African Americans to pay to vote. And as we know through sharecropping and several other things, African Americans at this time, that was hard. So poll taxes, they were required to pay to vote. The second is a literacy test. Where African Americans had to prove that they could read and write, but these weren't standard tests where you read and write. I took one of them when I was in high school. I'll try to find one for you guys so you guys can see what it was like. Nobody passed it in my class. So in an 11th grade APUSH class, none of us could pass a literacy test. And their rule was if you miss one question, you cannot vote. So I'll see if I'll find a sample online for you guys to look at so you can see how ridiculous it is. And finally, the grandfather clause. And what the grandfather clause means is if your grandfather could not vote, neither could you. So if you were a newly freedman in the South, good chances your grandfather was also enslaved and was not able to vote in his lifetime. Last slide, we're going to go through very quickly. The Supreme Court case that officially legalizes and allows segregation is Plessy versus Ferguson. We're going to do a deep dive of Plessy versus Ferguson next week. Plessy argued under the 14th Amendment that segregation denied him his civil rights. So again, under Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy was an African-American man who argued that segregation broke his civil rights, which were protected under the 14th Amendment. Make sure you have 14th Amendment next to Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court ruled that as long as the facilities were separate but equal, segregation is constitutional. Yes, so the Supreme Court argued that as long as the facilities are separate but equal, the segregation is constitutional. Despite all of this backlash, African Americans do not just like sit down when it comes to segregation. They fight against it. One of the main groups that is formed to fight segregation is the NAACP. The NAACP is formed in 1909, and they work together to abolish segregation, oppose racism, and protect African American civil rights. The NAACP, along with allies like Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois, all work together for this goal to fight against segregation during the Jim Crow era, which we will discuss more later in a future lecture. Okay, that is it for the Reconstruction lecture. I'm going to go ahead and turn you guys over to the exit ticket. Make sure you follow our new system that we discussed yesterday. Make sure you name it. Make sure you claim it, make sure you explain it, and make sure you connect it. Once you submit your exit ticket and today's lecture notes, you guys are going to be free to go. I will be watching Google Classroom for those. Make sure your paragraph responses are 3 sentences long. You guys can go ahead and get started. If you have any questions about the lecture, feel free to chat me those privately and I can fill in the gaps.